that I can cover the issue in a brief enough way without our comrade chair conclude. I'll try to get there. For me, the issue of crisis is always a problematic one. As I say, as Paget said, you know, there is no African crisis. There is a crisis that creates a problematic for intellectuals to think about. That is to say, that for the work I've been interested in amongst the shack dwellers in South Africa and amongst shack dwellers on the African continent. Africa, by the way, as a continent, is urbanizing quicker than any other continent and has more people living in shanty towns, a proportion of the urban population than any other continent. For shack dwellers, every day is a crisis, right? So in other words, to think about crisis is to think about an alternative epistemological standpoint. And then to think about it in terms of what Paget's talking about, to think about it as a crisis within the national projects for independence themselves, a crisis that Fanon spoke about in The Wretched of the Earth as a kind of laziness of the intellectuals, right? The ways in which the divisions between intellectuals, the divisions between the nationalist bourgeoisie and the mass movements manifest themselves almost immediately after the flag is flown above, you know, the new Parliament building. So I want to think about terms of crisis as a kind of intellectual standpoint, as a critique of intellectuals. And to begin to think about that, I want to just mention one thing from where I'm coming from, and that is something that's happened fairly recently. And I suppose also parenthetically to think about it in terms of Paget's division between state discourses and popular discourses, right? In other words, what I'm talking about is popular discourses that are absolutely silenced, right? Who hears the voices of the shack dwellers? Who hears the poorest of the poor speaking, right? They are silent, right? So even if you're critical of the state, you will probably hear representations of the poor by NGOs and left organisations, right? But you won't actually hear the poor speaking for themselves. So this becomes a problematic, right? To actually think about how these people are represented. Of course, I'm here representing them too, which is also an issue. On February 29th, the UN produced a report to the General Assembly about a report from the mission to South Africa on human rights and so forth. A special report on adequate housing as a component of the right to an adequate standard of living and non-discrimination. And they reminded us in the report of the South African Constitution, heralded it as an example for the protection of economic, social and cultural rights, including the right to adequate housing and so forth. This report you can get, it's quite good actually for a UN report. It's really, if you don't know anything about what's happening in South Africa, you can get it online. Then on, now South Africa does have very good protections for the right to housing. In other words, you know, during apartheid, the whole movement of people, forced removal and so forth of people was something that was struggled against and was something that was important to, in other words, the post-colonial, right, constitution. It's something important. This is now being set back. And in Cape Town, for example, if you go to Cape Town, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Cape Town, but if you go to Cape Town and you go from the airport to Cape Town itself, you'll notice as you go along the N2 gateway that there's thousands and thousands of people living on shacks right near the roadway. Now the thing is, what's happened in Cape Town, and this especially in the context of a kind of booming economy, gold, by the way, very expensive nowadays in dollars, was very good for the elites in South Africa. And also the World Cup coming in 2010 means there is a kind of elite development in places like South Africa, which has been happening maybe for 10 years, including, you know, worldwide elites having places. You know, it's a beautiful place, Cape Town. You know, Madonna and other people live there, and so forth. Anyway, they're moving these people out. They want to move these people out of these shacks. They've been living there about 15 years. And there's one shack settlement called Joe Slovo. Joe Slovo, you might remember, was the leader of the Communist Party in South Africa who died about 10 years ago. Anyway, fought apartheid for many years. They want to move these people out. And these people have just lost a court case, right, in Cape Town. And they're going to be forcibly removed to a place called Delft. Now, Delft is on the Cape Flats. The Cape Flats is about 20 miles away from Cape Town. From these people who live, these shack dwellers' livelihoods, right? Delft, in other words, the shack dwellers are the poorest of the poor. The people that live in Delft, 20 miles out, in the sand and barren areas of the Cape Flats, are the poorest of the poorest, right? And in fact, these people who are living in Joe Slovo will be shifted out to housing, new housing, right, which sounds very good, in Delft, which is presently being squatted by very, very poor people in Delft itself. So they have to evict people to get these people from Joe Slovo who don't want to move there to move into Delft, which has no economic kind of viability, 20 miles from jobs, schools, hospitals, and so forth. Right out there in nowhere's land. And essentially into housing, which itself is, you know, one asks oneself when one sees these houses, you know, what is a house, right? In other words, when you think about a house, it's not exactly the kind of thing that is being built there. You know, South Africa talks about building all these new houses and so forth, but, you know, they aren't very big. They're about 10 foot square. They have asbestos in the roofs. They leak. The toilets don't work properly, so on and so forth, right? So in other words, a whole issue of moral questions about development. In other words, what is development? Another question that always goes along with crisis, right? African crisis, African development, you know. So I want to kind of begin this notion of crisis, right? And this isn't only something happening in South Africa. If you go, you know, there's enormous shanty towns in Kibera, in Kenya, in Lagos, and so forth. In other words, this is a continental issue. We're talking about 20, 30 years of structural adjustment and urbanization, which has meant that people have moved to urban areas. Now, one last point in terms of thinking about it in terms of crisis and a critique of intellectuals. One issue that you may have known is Mike Davis's book, Planet of the Slums, right? Now, the problem with Mike Davis's book, Planet of the Slums, is that poor people don't actually speak in Mike Davis's book, Planet of the Slums. It's a nightmare, right? Okay, it's a nightmare. It's Dickensian, you know, it's dark, and so forth. But the crisis is explained as this kind of nightmarish human crisis without any agency or subjectivity amongst those people who live in the shanty towns. And in fact, if there is any agency and subjectivity, it's all about Christian or Muslim fundamentalism, and it's all about kind of a Hobbesian world of everyone fighting against each other in these dire situations and not having any, you know, toilets or any kind of solidarity amongst themselves. In other words, it's a classic lumpen proletariat. So my position, which I hope to explain in the next section, is to sort of say something else about a new social movement that has developed in South Africa